So, all right, so welcome back, everyone. Thank you again for joining ConvergX at CES, the partner program. Now we are going into our keynote presentation. We are now happy to welcome Dr. Geordie Rose, co-founder of D-Wave, the world's first quantum computing company. Kindred, acquired by Ocado, the world's first robotics company to use reinforcement learning in a production environment, and Sanctuary, a mission-driven company attempting to build artificial general intelligence. He has sold quantum computers and robots that learn to Google, NASA, Lockheed Martin, The Gap, and several US government agencies. D-Wave and Kindred were both ranked by MIT Technology Review among the top 50 smartest companies in the world in 2014 and 2017, respectively. Geordie has spoken at TED and a range of other high-profile events, has received coverage from The Economist, New York Times, Wired, MIT Tech Review, Science and Nature magazines, and in February 2014, a D-Wave quantum processor was featured on the cover of Time magazine. A Harvard Business School case was written on D-Wave in 2003. There is much more to say about Geordie, so his bio is on the ConvergX.co website, which you can go and check out. But you're not here to hear me talk, you're here to listen to him, so I will turn it over to you now, Geordie.
Thanks, Kim, and thanks everybody for coming out and hearing part of the story that I'm going to be telling. So I want to just start by talking about something that's may not sound at all related to general intelligence, but it is, and it's the fact that the cost of actually delivering labor is a lot higher than the salaries that you pay people. So the reasons for this can be many. One of the reasons could be that, for example, you have a facility up in the north of Canada and you need to fly people into work. So the costs of doing that are borne by the company, and they're greater than the cost that you pay the people to actually do the work. And so the question I'd like to start with is, given that the value of work and the cost of delivering it has such a huge gap, what if that wasn't true? So what if if you only paid for the thing that you want to have done and all of this other overhead could somehow magically vanish? What if labor was a commodity like electricity or water, and you could turn it on when you need it, turn it off when you don't? How would that affect your business? So most of the people who are here, I understand, think about things like the cost lines in your organization. Think about the enormous amount that you pay people to do things, and then think about the not just in terms of salary, but overhead and all that sort of thing. So imagine you could just cut out all that overhead. What would it do? So I'm going to present first a fantasy world, and then I'm going to ground it in reality. So the fantasy world looks something like this. Imagine there was a type of robot, which I'll call a general purpose robot. And a general purpose robot can't do everything a person can do, but it can do a lot of what a person can do. Specifically, it has hands like a person, it has a vision and audio system like a person, and it can think like a person. So in the example that I've rendered here, maybe the job of this particular robot is to pick lettuce heads off a conveyor belt. And it just does that all day long. Now, it could be anything. In all of your businesses, you could imagine that you have examples of things like this, where a person is doing a thing, maybe over and over and over again, and you pay them to do that. So this might be an example. The general purpose nature of the robot comes in the following sense. So this robot was not designed to pick lettuce heads off a conveyor belt. It was designed to be able to do the sorts of things that people do, which include picking lettuce heads off the conveyor belt. So if you could build a system like this, one day it might be doing this job, but the next day it might be doing a totally different job. And as long as it was physically capable of doing it, and it was, call it, cognitively capable of doing it, you could just move it around from place to place. You could put it in front of the conveyor belt one day and you could have it do something completely different the other day. And if you didn't need it at all, a truck could wheel up to your warehouse and load it back on the truck, and it could go somewhere else and do something else. So far this is just fantasy world. But there's a way to turn this fantasy world into reality, and it doesn't take 20 years and super big advances in artificial intelligence. And it's actually quite simple. The concept is that you don't control the robot using a sophisticated robot control system that is artificial. Instead, you control the robot using a very sophisticated control system, which is biological, which is a human. So on the picture on the left, I've shown an image of a drone pilot. So you're probably familiar with this use of this type of technology where in this specific scenario of drone piloting, you have a flying drone and you have a human, and the human has certain control over the behavior of the drone, potentially its entire behavior, where it goes, what it does, in the military sense, being the human in the loop that makes sure that the sorts of things that were talked about before I came on have human oversight. Um, but this process of controlling a robot with a human, it has a remarkable side effect, and that's that the human mind is amazingly plastic. It can adjust itself to perform feats that are far beyond what you could think that physical machine could do by controlling it directly. And I'm going to show you a little bit more about how this works in practice in a bit. But the high level notion I want you to think about is now we've kind of reduced the complexity of that fantasy world robot on the right to remove the problem of actually allowing it to move like a person would, and replaced it with the problem of, can we actually build a physical system that's like that fantasy world? Can we build a general purpose robot? Now, you might have come into this from the title thinking robots with general intelligence means something like, Chappie or something like that. But that's not what it means. From the perspective of a customer or a user of this product, what it means is that the robot can deliver human intelligence in the performance of its task. From the customer perspective, you don't have to care where it comes from. If it comes from a pilot, fine. If it comes from an AI, same thing. From your perspective, it's still doing the same job and it's still costing the same amount. So why do you care? Now, where AI primarily enters into the cycle from our perspective and how we think of the automation of this particular task, or how automation enters into it, is that the AI's role is very specific. It watches the pilots do their work and it finds ways to make the pilots better at their job. And that means that providing an aid to the accomplishment of the task. And I'll give you an example. Maps, Google Maps, or Apple Maps, whatever. So you've got the job, which is drive from place to place. Now there's still a human driving the car, usually, but the human augmented with this piece of technology becomes a kind of a super-powered driver. If we took two fleets of drivers, one of them that had access to digital maps and the other one didn't, and we put them in competition with each other, these guys would obliterate these guys in every metric. So the provisioning of AI-enabled tooling to help do work is something that happens all the time. And it can happen in this context also, even though it's a little bit of an unusual way to think about how to deliver work. Another way to kind of think about what I'm showing you here is that historically labor has dogmatically been the case that the work and the worker have to be in the same place. So when I'm picking lettuce off a conveyor belt, I can't take the worker and have them do it from home because there's a physical task that needs to be done, and I can't do that over a Zoom call. So this idea is an extension of Zoom, what we're doing now, to the movement of atoms in the real world. If you have a machine that can actually affect the real world and you can control it over an internet link, you break this convergence of work and worker. The work and the worker don't need to be in the same place anymore, and you can do all sorts of physical things that you couldn't otherwise do. But remember, this is still a fantasy world so far. So the way that you think about this as customers, if you're a user of this, is that the business model is you only pay for the work that's done, and you only pay what you think that's worth. So no health benefits, no air conditioning in your warehouse, no rehiring people because you've got 30% turnover every month. None of that. That all goes away. Instead, what you do is every time one of these robots completes a task that you deem to be important and you deem to have a certain value, you pay that amount, and that's it. You don't buy a robot ever. You scale the labor to be whatever it happens to be, the tasks that are at hand today, and you have the amount of labor available that is the amount that you need, no more and no less. All right, so that's fantasy world. Now I'm going to start showing you real world. What I'm going to show you are parts of the system that are these robots that I'm showing you here. I'm going to show you some of the components. I'm not going to show them all together yet, but I'll show you some pieces. Oh, actually, before they do that, I should just say a little bit about my background. So, and the things that the kind of the roots of this technology. So all of this started back in 1999 with the founding of D-Wave. Some of you may have heard of this company. It was the first company to take on the challenge of building quantum computers. Quantum computer is a type of computer that is unusual in many respects. And D-Wave was the pioneer that started this whole industry back in 1999. I was the founder. My background is in theoretical physics. I became an entrepreneur after, thinking about being a professor and deciding that wasn't a good idea. And I founded and ran D-Wave for a while, and then I took over as CTO. During the process of working at D-Wave, I was very fortunate to run into a whole bunch of very smart people. And the core of that team thought about using some of the things we were doing to move robots around. And that eventually turned into a company called Kindred. So Kindred was our first foray into using advanced artificial intelligence and piloting to build robots that do things in the real world, much like what I'm talking about now, except with a special purpose robot and a special purpose task instead of this general idea. And Kindred was acquired a couple months ago by Ocado. All right, so now I'm going to show you the torso of the robot. So the end effectors and the called the head of this robot are just stand-ins right now to do some testing, but kind of get the idea. So this is just showing the robot kind of working through its paces. And if we wanted to ground this in the previous fake picture, so if we go back to one of these fake pictures, the robot here, what I'm showing you is everything from, say, the wrist to the head. So that thing I just showed you is the body of this robot. Now, that motion pattern stuff that I showed you is indicative of the sort of motion that this robot could perform. It's vaguely anthropomorphic. It's got two arms. It moves like a person. It's got shoulders and all of that. But it's missing something very important. So in that robot I showed you, the end effectors were just kind of stumps. They were just there to be, the kinds of things that allow you to do proper torque calculations and things like that. But if you think about like how do humans change the world? So the world is a certain way. How do we change it? And almost entirely the answer is with our hands. So most economic work is delivered through what we can think of as end effectors, these things. And think about how you affect the world. So most of the change that happens around you comes through your hands. When you wash the dishes, you use your hands. You don't use your, feet. It's your hands that do that work. And most labor is delivered through human hands, including in the robotics industry. In some ways of thinking about it, all a robot is a way to move an end effector to a place. It's the end effector that creates the value, and the rest of it is just there to get the thing to where it's going. In our world of engineered artifacts, the technium, the thing that surrounds us, all this stuff that we've built and are building, all of it is designed to be grasped and interacted with the human hand because of this. So every industry is filled with examples of work that's done where the primary delivery of the value is through the hands. And that robot I showed you doesn't have any. So another thing I'm going to show you now is the work that we've been doing on generating human-like, at least in terms of function, hands that can be moved the way that a human hand can, that can interact with the world like humans can. So I'll just show you that. This guy's missing his pinky because it hasn't been installed yet, but you get the idea. So that's just a short snippet, but you kind of get the idea. The design requirement on this is that it has the same degrees of freedom as the human hand, all of them. Those are about 20 or so. And it, you can see the outside of this thing is covered by that kind of like a coppery stuff and circuits. Those are sensors. So the way that this hand is built, it has two innovative parts. One is the ability to move like a human hand, but it's also got a bunch of sensors that are meant to mimic the type and density of sensors that the human hand has, which are exceptionally important when you're thinking about navigating the world. So most robot grippers don't have haptic feedback. They don't know what they're touching or how, the same way a person would. So this design is meant to overcome that type of issue. Now, what I've showed you here is part of the underpinnings, because I wanted to sort of show you the guts of it. But just like if I showed you a skeleton moving around without skin on it, it would look kind of weird. Notice that, of course, you can cover this with anything you like. So one of the things that you could cover a hand like this with is a mold cast from a human hand. So one of the founders of our company had her hand molded in silicone into like a, think of it like a glove, and then we slip it over something like this. And I'm going to show you that because it really changes the aesthetic. And just remember, I'm not saying that we're going to cover our robot hands with this sort of thing. It's just indicating that the aesthetic of a robot, what it looks like, what it feels like, is changeable at will. So I'll show you the same thing but covered with this kind of glove. So it looks an awful lot like a human hand, but underneath it's just that thing that I showed you. Like it's even got like the little crevices and whatnot, because that's just what happens when you mold a hand in silicone. And of course the hands can look anything like anything you like. Okay. So I'm gonna just end this by saying that the type of robot that we're talking about, which is a basically functionally kind of human-like, with these advanced end effectors, which you can think of as hands covered in sensors, with all of the sorts of computer vision and audio stuff that you'd expect. Like for example, when you're teleoperating one of these robots, if I'm the person who's actually moving the robot, when I speak into the microphone, the voice comes out of the robot's face, right? So if you're stood in front of one of these robots, I can say, hey, robot, I don't want you to pick Coke off the shelf anymore. Leave those there. I just want you to pick the Pepsis off the shelf. And of course, the human who's hearing you say this, even though they're in Indonesia or wherever they're at, says, okay, I get it. And they put the Coke back, and now they're only pulling Pepsis off the stand. Now, this ability to task change on the fly using verbal commands is a superpower. You know, usually when you buy a robot or you use a robot, if you want to change what it's doing, it's this huge involved process involving PhDs and, you know, time and money. This, it's 5 seconds. So I could literally tell this robot, stop doing what you're doing and do that other thing, and it'll just start doing it right away with no cost to the user at all. So my ask here is that everybody on this call, if you can think of a way to use this thing, contact James. I put his email on the screen here. And because we're actively looking for the first place to put these things into production. So we are at the stage now where these science fiction drawings that I'm showing you are no longer only science fiction. They're starting to morph into being real. Not quite there yet, but getting there. And what we're looking for are essentially the best types of environments and use cases to deploy these things. And for a guide to thinking about what makes a good task, think of the 5Ds. I'm sure this has come up before. So the 5Ds are anything that's dirty, dangerous, dull, i.e. repetitive, distant, which means there's a cost to getting the person to the work, like remote work or something down in a mine or, you know, under the water or whatever. And the last D for us is dexterous, which means that the use of the human hand is critical to the task. You couldn't do it with a robotic gripper, or at least it wouldn't be the right tool to use. All right, thanks very much.
Wonderful. Thank you, Geordie. That was amazing. So, Geordie, if you want to stop sharing your screen, if anybody has any questions, we can just do the raise hand feature. So if you just go to where the participants are and your name, you can raise your hand and certainly ask Geordie any questions that you may have. I'll just give everybody a couple of seconds here, or just speak up if you can't figure out how to find the raise hand feature. I'm just doing a quick scan. So Geordie, are you looking for, is there any particular situation that you would like to have those robots placed, or is it pretty much open?
Well, right now we've got a pretty open bore approach where we're looking at everything that you could imagine. There are some constraints that make something a better choice. One of them is there's some unusual economics at play that are making it so that you're spending an awful lot more than just the salary of the person on delivering the work. So I've mentioned several times this idea of remote in the sense of really remote work. Northern Canada, outback in Australia, that kind of stuff. If you have a set of your workforce that's working in somewhere where it's an inhospitable remote environment where you're paying an awful lot to put them up or get them to the place or back, that's a potential good situation. Although there are lots of things that aren't exactly that have the same dynamic. You're paying more than you should for the thing that you want done. That's one. The other thing to mention is that right now these robots are tethered and static. So you're only talking about from the waist up. So what this means is that if you have a use case where the robot requires mobility, like moving around the world, that's not a blocker, because you can do all sorts of things to make a robot like this mobile. You can use your imagination. Those are things that exist in the world. If you don't want to use your imagination, put it on a Segway base and drive it around with a joystick. So there are ways to move these things around the world, but it's not the first thing we want to do, because the mobility challenge is an additional engineering challenge, which is already on top of an enormously hard project. So the best kind of case for us is a situation where you can put a robot in a place like in front of a conveyor belt or something like that, and its mobility is limited. Like you can still move it around and move it from place to place, but it would be better if it was like able to stay in one spot. If it can't, it's not a blocker. We could think about mobility issues, but it's not the first thing I'd like to tackle.
Of course. So some of the questions that are popping up is, how much would it cost to work with this or put this robot somewhere with you?
So it's very important to understand that the model here costs you absolutely nothing at the beginning, except the time that it takes for us to work together to figure out the economics of your tasks. So the initial engagement is we sit with you, we create what we think of as a duty cycle of an economic task. Where does it start? Where does it end? What are the steps in the middle? And how much does it cost you right now to deliver that particular thing? So in the conveyor belt example, how much, what is it really like to pick a lettuce head off a conveyor belt? So I've deployed a real product in the real world before at Kindred. I am absolutely 100% clear on the fact that when you do this in the lab, it's nothing like what actually happens on the floor of your workspace. So what the first part of this engagement is really about information collection and figuring out, is there actually a good match, both technologically and economically. That doesn't cost the customer anything except time and some thought cycles. When the thing is actually beginning to be deployed, the model is very simple. If you think it costs, you want to pay 7 cents for every lettuce head, you only pay 7 cents for every lettuce head. You don't buy robots. There's no CapEx at all. If you want 5 robots today and 0 tomorrow, we wheel them out the next day. It doesn't cost you a cent. So this idea of like a liquid workforce is what we're trying to enable here. The only cost is the cost of delivering the work in a way that the customer believes is a fair price for delivering the capacity.
All right. Some of the other questions that have come up are, what is the mass that the robot can lift?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Right now, we're focusing on objects that we could consider to be on the light end of the spectrum for a person. So that is right now somewhere around under around 5 kilograms. So if anything is above about 5 kilograms, is probably outside of the scope of what we'd want to look at. And a better fit here are items that are at the low end of that, like say under a kilo. So things like food, um, the sort of things that you'd find in a grocery store that are on the shelves, the sorts of things that a human can most people could just lift, maybe with a little bit of trouble, but not too much, that kind of thing. No iron beams, no construction work, none of that. Relatively lightweight things.
All right. Let's see here. I have somebody who said that they have a project where they're using AI to teach people to play the violin. They would love to use it to help people play the violin and piano. And that,
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
So piano thought about these sorts of tasks, obviously. Uh, so piano and violin are two very different types of instruments, of course. Playing the piano is much more, let's say, digital than the violin. The violin involves a lot of analog motions. So these systems, and one way you can think about that is like player pianos and things like this have existed forever, but player violins don't, as far as I know, at least not that are any good. So those are two different types of tasks. I think that having this robot actually play the piano is a very easy task for a robot like this. It would be, I wouldn't say trivial, but it would be very, very simple to automate. You wouldn't actually need a human in the loop at all, because as long as you can locate yourself relative to the actual piano, how big a piano is and all that is a known thing, and the relative positions are also known, so you don't have to guess or have uncertainty about any of that. So I think that playing the violin would be very difficult through one of these robots, although it's an interesting idea.
One other question that came up: in many dangerous distant work sites also have explosive conditions. Are there thoughts to qualify these to work in these environments?
Yeah, so there's a whole host of issues about the regulatory side of this type of approach. So this is really dependent on the specifics of the application. One of the clear, so it's a complicated answer, I suppose, but one of the obvious things is that if you've got a really dangerous piece of work that could potentially or does harm people that are doing it, bomb disposal is an example, robots like this can do those things, and if they get blown to hell, it's just a robot. So in the case of like a dangerous task that requires an awful lot of human knowledge and understanding to diffuse or otherwise perform the task, this might be an ideal fit. So you could take one of these guys and do something very complicated that requires a lot of human expertise and maybe dexterous manipulation, without putting a person directly in danger.
Mm-hmm. So I have time for one more question, and that'll go to Meyer's question, which was, do you envision a software industry growing up around this to use the same robot differently?
Yeah, so that's an excellent question. I'd say I'm not sure. I think like from my approach to technology development has always been, even though I tend to work on things that are a little bit like weird, like quantum computing and reinforcement learning and things, I'm actually quite tactical in the way I think about problems. Like for me, it's always what's the thing on the horizon, not like thinking about things too deeply. And I think part of the reason that's been successful is there's so much uncertainty in this sort of thing. Like you can't really predict how this is going to go. So for me, it's all about what do we have to do today. And my view is that the best way to begin this thing to kind of kickstart an industry is as soon as humanly possible, get one of these things out in the world actually doing a thing, because they're having been in the robotics industry for kind of half my professional career, it's very easy to show you things like I showed you today, where it looks great, or I'm telling a wonderful story and there's lots of renders and wonderful stories about robots, being your house, the work, doing your housework or whatever. But actually doing it for real has an awful lot more currency than showing you all this stuff. So for me, I think I would like to differentiate our effort from others that are kind of similar or in the same space on one axis specifically, and that's the reality of the thing. So I want these things out in the world doing things now. So unfortunately, this is a tough thing that I can't do it today, but part of the process of doing it now is not having blinders on about the reality of actually doing a thing in the real world, and you only get that from working with a customer. So the main ask I'm putting on the folks in the audience is, If you have a thing that you think might be a good fit, reach out to James. Again, the email is james@sanctuary.ai. I'll say it again, james@sanctuary.ai. Reach out to him. It doesn't matter how bizarre or weird it is, because we're looking at everything now. And it could be, there are a lot of things we haven't even remotely talked about that might be good fits. I'll give you one example: sterilizing medical equipment. So anything where you have something that's relatively small and you need to do something with your hands and it happens over and over and over again, that's a potentially a good fit. We want to hear about your problem. We want to help you solve it, or at least determine whether we can. And you could be the very first place where one of these things makes money. You know, it could be the very first time when this type of system actually does something real in the world. And I think that's going to be a historical event.
Absolutely. Well, thank you so much for your time, Geordie. We saw that James put in his email in the chat there. So again, if you missed it, it is in the chat and you can go reference the chat. Again, we'd like to thank you for taking the time to speak with us today. It was an amazing and very interesting discussion.